Łacio-dziwes. Let me begin with a picture. In 1971, some leaders met near London and set up the agenda that several decades after resonated with some, not all, ordinary Roma civil society and representatives and policymakers at international and national levels. The meeting held near London under the auspices of the Committee of International Tsigan, originally intended to be a preparatory. It turned out to be the first Congress itself. Gratan Paxson, a non-Roma, was elected secretary, and Slobodan Berberski, a Roma himself from Belgrade, Yugoslavia, president. Important is that those gathered there undertook some decision meaningful for the future, as for example, adoption of the flag and Atem Gelem Gelem, the agreement to use the term Roma instead of Gypsy or Tsigan. Later on, at the 4th Congress of IRU in Jadwiszyn, Poland, in 1990, opening day of the conference, 8th of April, was established as the International Roma National Day. At that time, there was nearly no structures of Roma self-representation set up in the divided Europe. Comparing it with present time, in span of several decades since the fall of communism, a complex and evolving infrastructure was built up and increasing funding was secured to serve the Roma cause and communities in uniting Europe. Yet, the feeling among the most Roma representatives and civil society leaders, not to speak about some non-Roma scholars, is that not much has been achieved. Why so? Why such a big discrepancy between what has been supposedly achieved in recommendations, commitments, programs, and projects, and what have not been reached in practice, meaning tangible change on the ground? Are such views justified? My simple answer would be no. Before I will elaborate more on this, I would like to set a stage for my lecture. I will divide my lecture into two parts, historical one and second, more scientific and polemic. In the first part, I will try to illustrate general tendencies or directions the movement took, far from being detailed though. In the second part, I will raise several, and in my view, controversial issues or misunderstood issues which have been criticized by those who wrote about Romani movement. Until the 4th Congress in 1990, with few exceptions, for example Germany, the transnational movement appeared to be a main forum for meeting other Roma individuals and debating the future of Roma. Until the fall of communism, IRU dominated the space and did not have a rival organization. The IRU worked globally and it has been oriented to the UN. Anyway, it is surprising that the idea of transnational movement originated with some Roma from France, a country known from its republican views regarding citizenship and rejections of any ethnic or minority rights. Engagement of Yugoslavia in establishing transnational Roma movement, at the time active in the non-alignment movement of the Third World, is less surprising. However, as a consequence of it is that Roma from Yugoslavia were overrepresented in leadership of the movement, at least until the Congress in 1990. Another factor that shaped the movement has been brought in by Germany's Nazi past. The first meeting near London in 1971 already included the issue of extermination and reparations. Legitimate arguments were raised in this regard by Romani Rose, who did join the movement only once, in 1981 in Göttingen, West Germany. He became also one of the ERU's vice presidents. At that time, he was just after a series of protests, including hunger strikes in former Nazi death camps in Bergen-Belsen in 1979 and in Dachau in 1980, and just before the statement of Chancellor Helmut Schmidt in 1982, in which he assumed the Germany's responsibility for racial persecution of Sinti and Roma during Nazi era. Rose, therefore, used successfully transnational movement for domestic purposes and his struggle with the German authorities. Another Roma leader from Germany emerged in the end of 80s and the beginning of 90s, addressing issues of Roma migrants and asylum seekers in Germany with a Nazi past in the background. At the Fourth Congress in Poland, Rutko Kawczyński, with his Roma and Sinti Union organization and strong German citizenship, emerged as a champion in struggling with Germany for the rights of Roma asylum seekers. Soon after, he developed the idea of the Roma National Congress that emerged in 1992, and the European Roma Charter, a kind of Roma constitution, boosting further the idea of the Roma nation. However, he was careful to demand national minority status at national state level and the recognition of Roma as a nation by multilateral organizations. Later on, this idea was shaped further in the form of transnational non-Roma, non-territorial nation and the declaration of Roma nation after the Prague Congress in 2000. In general, alignment with the issue of Nazi Germany persecution of Roma in Europe and migration of Roma have shaped the movement to a large extent. So what I consider to be a Roma movement? I consider Roma movement an ethnic movement advocating for a change in the existing status quo through lobbying, advocacy, and/or collective action. It brings together individuals representing a variety of organizations such as civil society organizations, parties, or foundations, or faith organizations that voice discontent, come up with the vision for the future, and for this purpose use politics to raise it up. Roma movement is basically a human and minority rights movement, as neither secession, like in Catalan case, or independence, like in Kosovars, were and are in the scope of it. I speak about the Romani movement in a single terms, as it brings together representatives and leaders of Roma community dispersed in many countries who feel the sense of belonging to the ethnic community, though they are also citizens of a given state. Some scholars discuss early stages of the Romani movement, looking for the people and structures in pre-World War II era. For me, it is decisive whether there is a possibility to link pre-World War II developments with those after the World War II. Instead of links, I see interruptions caused by the Nazi war itself and the number of Roma exterminated during it in Europe. While I do recognize that there were some steps made in this direction in earlier times, I leave those developments out of my reflection as isolated or fragmented. The turning point for me, therefore, is the meeting of 1971 that led eventually to the establishment of the International Romani Union in 1978. With this, a so-called transnational Romani movement was born, and in fact dominated the space. It might be useful to see what structures we have had prior to the 71 Congress. In the West, there were several organizations established by church with mixed membership, for example, Secretariato Gitano. In Spain, active since 1962, and Opera Nomadi in Italy, founded in 1963. Both organizations were doing activities in the area of education. In West Germany, Oskar and Vincent Rose established Association of Racially Persecuted Non-Jews already in 1956. Out of this association evolved the Association of German Sinti in 1972, whose local and regional organization eventually merged to form the Central Council of German Sinti and Roma, led by Romani Rose. In France, in 1960, Lionel Rotaru founded the World Gypsy Committee, or CMG, in Paris. From CMG, which was dissolved by French government in 1965, the Committee International Tsigan evolved, headed by Vanko Roda. In UK, the Gypsy organization was struggling to secure caravan site provision, eventually successfully, and Gratan Paxson and Gypsy Council, established in 1966, were instrumental in this process. Later on, he co-authored with Donald Kenrick a seminal book on gypsies, Persecution Under Nazi Europe, The Destiny of Europe's Gypsies, published in 1973. In the communist bloc, there were few Roma organizations typically allowed to act by the regime, cultural or educational organizations, and if considered subversive, they were closed. For example, in Hungary, first association was established in 1957, the Hungarian Gypsy Cultural Association, which existed only for 2 years. Then the Gypsy Council, headed by Andrzej Lakatos, a writer, was created in 1974, and in 1985 was succeeded by the National Gypsy Council, headed by Józef Daroci. The situation has been different in Yugoslavia. There were many organizations, up to 60 in 70s, and Roma activism was supported officially by communist state. The fall of communism and transition were therefore a major breakthrough also for Roma population. Democratization, but also human rights abuses against Roma, especially pogroms and Roma migration, so characteristic for the transition period, helped to develop and multiply Roma civil society and to lobby international and national audiences in Europe. Most of major Roma organizations were established at that period. Just prior to the fall, such as Horvat Aladar's Roma Parliament, established in 1988. Later on, he became one of the first MPs in Hungarian Parliament. He served from 1990 to 1994. Or just after the fall, for example, Human Rights Project of Dimitar Georgiev, established in 1992, or Romani Cris, the Center for Social Intervention and Studies by Nicolae Gheorghe, established in Romania in 1993, just to mention few. Key in this development was the year of 1994 and the OSCE Human Dimension Conference on Roma in Warsaw, organized together with the Council of Europe. Most of the Roma leaders were participating in this event, among them Romani Rose, Nicolae Gheorghe, Rutko Kawczynski, Jan Hancock, and from among non-Roma, for example, Jean-Pierre Lijoua, a main expert to the Council of Europe on Roma issues. Intense discussions and debates were held during official sessions and at the informal meetings, for example, regarding naming of the future office at the ODIHR. Rose was supported officially by German delegation, and we ended up with 2 terms in the name of contact point, Roma and Sinti. The results of those discussions were significant. Small offices were established at the ODIHR in 1994, and larger one in the form of advisory body, MGS Rome, at the Council of Europe, 1995. While the first one was looking into the issues of Roma from the perspective of security, especially in conflict and post-conflict areas, the latter one was addressing human rights and minority rights, including social and economic rights of Roma across Europe. The Council of Europe and the OSCE were a reference point for the Roma movement and a learning ground for other international organizations regarding Roma. For example, Dina Ringgold, representing the World Bank, or Detlef Bowing, representing the European Commission, participated in many meetings of both organizations. Important for the development of Roma civil society at national level and for the Roma movement at the transnational level were also 2 main private institutions: the Project on Ethnic Relations, OPER, since 1991, and George Soros Network, I think since 1995. These 2 sources of private support were complementary, though not always in coordination and in agreement with each other. PER has been supporting a small number of educated Roma to become counterparts for the government officials. Soros and his network has been investing in recruiting educated young Roma leaders and developing Romani organizations that would effectively implement and monitor local and governmental Roma issues and Roma-related policies and programs. To close this part, the Roma movement became more complex, and the role of Roma civil society in it have significantly increased, especially when it refocused on the new stakeholder, the EU. Let me move to the decade of 2000. 2 developments characterized this phase, and both have resulted in the EU's stronger engagement with Roma population. The 1999 Copenhagen criteria for accession and the Kosovo War, causing significant number of Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptians among refugees and IDPs. Less pronounced in public, but equally important for the development of Roma, was 1999 decision of OSCE Ministerial Council from Istanbul on developing Roma and Sinti Action Plan. Nicolae Gheorghe, being advisor at the OSCE, was responsible for that. It took him nearly 4 years of organizing consultations with a variety of stakeholders until the final document with recommendations was adopted in Maastricht 2003. In some of this consultation, I have participated. On the other hand, Soros and the World Bank, supported by a young generation of leaders of Roma civil society, came with alternative idea of the decade of Roma inclusion at the conference in Budapest in July 2003, and with launching it in Sofia, Bulgaria in 2005. Both initiatives were guided by different and rather difficult to reconcile ideas. The first one was operating with anti-discrimination perspective and aimed to be comprehensive, covering many areas, including post-conflict. The second focused on 4 areas but used the language of social inclusion typical of EU. Altogether, the OSCE Action Plan of 2003, the accession in 2004, and the launching of the Decade Initiative in 2005 did revitalize the Roma policy formulation and its implementation. However, did not prevent Roma migration to the West that unfolded around these years and have made more urgent Roma policy formulation at the EU. Especially after 2007 EU enlargement that brought in Bulgaria and Romania with their high Roma populations. I did not devote much time to the creation of another structure associated with Council of Europe, the European Roma and Travelers Forum, or ERTA. It should be sufficient to say that Finland's idea of providing a legitimate voice to Roma has been debated for several years, and it took Finland's diplomacy a lot of energy to turn it into a reality. The ERTF was eventually established in 2004, and Kawczynski became the first president of it. After several years of functioning, the special agreement it had with the Council of Europe was dissolved and ERTF became marginalized. I have to stop here. Continuing it would require another time slot for the lecturing. I would like to turn now to the second part, more scientific and polemic. I read lastly the book of Martin Kovac and Ian Law, Rethinking Roma, Identities, Politicization and New Agendas, published in 2018. And later on, I read again the text of Marusziakowa and Popov from 2005. They write about the same topics, the Roma movement, but arrive to opposing conclusions. Taking into consideration the time spent that divided both publications, I can admit that Kovac finally recognized Roma movement as a political project in Europe. Marusziakowa and Popov, however, see all in negatives. For them, the Roma identity is hardly existing and functional due to internal fragmentation, factionalism, and diversity among population known as gypsies, all developed by false or self-appointed professional Roma whose aim is to benefit from so-called gypsy industry they themselves sustain and develop. I do follow here on the view of Peter Vermersch, who does not question the existence of distinct Roma ethnicity and identity, though he is critical of Romani movement and its strategies of doing politics. In general, the way the history of Roma movement has been dealt with in scholarship may distort the reality of it. To explain why, I would like to reflect on few most common, according to me, flawed arguments that are present among the many academic critics of the Romani movement, namely diversity and unity, elite and masses, transnational and national. Regarding the first, diversity versus unity, for me it is possible to be diverse and yet aim for unity. Therefore, I do not see here gross contradiction as many mainstream scholars do. The predominant view among them is that internal diversity prevents building unity among Roma. For those critics, I would like to say, it's hard not to be diverse for a community dispersed among so many cultures, languages, and traditions, and living in those contexts for many centuries. To make it clear, diversity is part of our living reality. On the other hand, unity does not imply sameness, homogeneity of identity and culture. Unity implies, however, togetherness. Romani movement, at least from the beginning of 70s, is about forging such unity out of diverse groups, cultures, languages, and traditions. Efforts of Romani Rose to build a shared memory around the Holocaust need to be recognized here. Secondly, the perception of Roma movement as a dichotomy elite versus masses. Very often scholars and mainstream politicians claim that Roma educated strata or Roma elite is pushing something which serves their own interests but not masses, that the Roma masses have no clue about it or are indifferent to the issues raised by the elite. Elitism here is understood as being far from grassroots or losing touch with grassroots communities. In essence, the Roma movement is seen as elitist with no legitimacy among masses. However, when we look at the Roma movement and compare it with other social or ethnic movements, we conclude that any social movement have some people who mobilize others, and those are usually educated. That was also the case of Roma ethnic movement. Alternatively, we are run or guided by non-Roma elites and subordinated to them and their interests. With issue of elitism comes in the issue of knowledge production and NGOization, or blaming that sector for maintaining gypsy industry, as do Mariuszakova and Popov. Why some may be blamed for this, generalization on the issue has no ground. By the way, Rudko Kawczyński, heading at the time Roma National Congress, has been known for his criticism of non-Roma gypsy experts and blamed them for upholding gypsy industry. Third commonly debated issue is transnational versus national or local identity. Many mainstream scholars, including Van Baar and others, view declaration of some people in the movement too literary as endorsement of transnationality, meaning turning to international organization for protection and giving up their citizenship. In fact, members of the movement were fully aware that transnationalism of Roma explains their diversity and complexity, but does not take away their citizenship. It was always a useful political tool to pressure national governments, but not an objective in itself. Even Iru was afraid to take the offer of Indians and become Indian minority in Europe, as it would mean, such arguments were used, that we would lose our citizenship among Europe's states. This is a similar thinking as in the case of blaming Roma leaders and scholars for racialization or ethnicization or politicization of issues which are in nature social and not racial, ethnic, or political. See, for example, Kovac in 2003. I disagree. Blaming Roma for racialization or ethnicization ignores the fact that the Roma population was singled out by majority as others prior to anything. Regarding politicization, ethnic movements or any social movements aim to become political, and politics offer the best tools to gain visibility and mobilize people. That was and is obviously also the case of Roma in Europe. In this context, it is interesting to see discussion about the Romani movement and its future held by the European Roma Rights Center in December in 2001 in Budapest. Voices of non-Roma, Petrova, Goldstone, Rourke, Khan, were much more radical regarding what the movement should request. Roma activists and scholars, Rusinov, Ristich, Hancock, and Koche, were moderate and careful, problematizing whether we have a movement at all, for example, Ristich, or Hancock, who doubted whether there is indeed a concerted Romani movement. On the other hand, Angela Korche argued that transnationality and Romanation are rather an idea and a political tool, but not really a serious demand. I agree with those statements. In conclusion, the existing deficiencies of Roma movement, there are many, should not overshadow its achievements. On the other hand, problems of fragmentation or pluralism, competition between leaders and structures, challenges of mobilizing the masses are typical issues faced by any movement. The half a century long history of Roma movement should be known and remembered, to learn from failures but also celebrate successes. With the demise or irrelevance of some Roma stakeholders, for example, Iru currently split into several branches, the ERTF has been marginalized, or Project on Ethnic Relations non-existent. Those who invested time and energy in engaging with the EU, especially the OSF and Soros, proved to be right. We shall keep also in mind that Roma movement have its national dimension. There are a variety of stakeholders that act in the interest of the community or minority. I did not devote much time to it, but it is important to recognize efforts at that level. While we might be critical of the EU Roma policy, I believe the EU is a right direction for the future of the Roma movement. Thank you very much. Te avem să astea bahtale romale. Budbak.